Chuck, would you mind to lead us in a word of prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we can come together, and we pray that as we open the pages of your word, that we can look there with open minds and learn the things there that you have prepared for us. Pray that you'll bless our teacher in this particular class and all the other teachers in all the other classes here at this location. Pray that we can be receptive to your word, that it can prick our hearts and cause us to change our ways to be more like Jesus. All these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right. So on Wednesday, we got just into chapter 16. And I mentioned, but I want to mention again, we are entering into the third section of Matthew, which is opposing the king. Jesus has firmly established that he is the Christ, that he is deity, that he has divine power, and we're going to see the spread of opposition to Jesus beginning to grow, and his final preparation of his disciples. Not the multitudes, his direct group, his 12, and then some of those characters that we're going to see again pop up, particularly in Acts chapter 1 and after the crucifixion at the end of the Gospels. And he's going to make some final predictions, and then, of course, there will be the crucifixion in the later chapters of Matthew. But his suffering and his death are going to be themes that we're going to see throughout these chapters from 16 until 27. We ended on Wednesday talking about the sign of Jonah again. If I recall correctly, I could have read further and forgot, but we're going to start in verse 5, and we're going to read from there. We're going to read 5 through 12. When the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. And Jesus said to them, "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And they began discussing it among themselves, saying, "We brought no bread." But Jesus, aware of this, said, "O you of little faith, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not yet remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many baskets you gathered? How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread? Beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." They understood that he did not tell them beware of the leaven of bread, but that of the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Anything stick out in particular to anyone?
Tell him that he's capable of, he's already showed them twice that they don't need no bread. You got God in living form right in front of them. They can do anything. And he's just more or less stressing the Pharisees and the Sadducees, don't listen to anything they have to say because their heart is not right.
And kind of this overarching message of stop thinking about physical stuff. Like, it's not about the food. That's not a problem. But yes, very much that. The first thing I thought of is Matthew 13 and verse 33 and how this is very much the opposite of that. He tells the parable in 13:33 that the kingdom of heaven is like the leaven that a woman put and took and hid in 3 measures of flour till it was all leavened. These are using the same metaphor on opposite ends of the spectrum. What was the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees? What was their leaven?
Pretty much that you had to, keep the old law to the letter, which they never did, and,
Failing to have the mercy and justice, that, and doing things from the heart, they were just kind of going like a machine and following that law to the exclusion of anything else that might be remotely meaningful or.
Yeah, you're both right. And there was a third point that they were both very invested in making sure everyone understood, and that's that this man, Jesus, is not the Christ. He's something else. He's something we should not only avoid, it's something that we should hate. And that's what they were spreading. And that leaven, I think we can imply from what we know is going to happen, it grew. So we don't see the same, we do see people continuing to be interested in Jesus, but we start to see more public opposition. We start to see, well, I mean, especially as we get into the crucifixion, the crowds are not yelling of his miracles and his achievements. They're yelling blasphemy and crucify him.
A friend told me once that most of the time, not all the time in the Bible, when yeast is used or leaven is used figuratively, it almost always represents something bad or evil or sinful. So when you see the leaven or the yeast there, you'll start thinking that way, and you'll have a better chance of maybe understanding.
And yeah, and I mean 1333 is one of those that's opposite of that. And you're right, they are kind of rare. The kingdom, it will grow. And if we are motivated to change those around us through the word, it can happen. All right, anything else about the leaven before we move on to this very, very full section? All right. Go ahead, Marty.
Growing up and stuff, I never cooked much and stuff. And then, my wife was telling me I was making biscuits or something one morning. She said, put your leaven in there, make you flour. But I don't know what it was. But anyway, it doesn't, it's this little pinch. A whole big little thing of flour changes.
Mm-hmm.
So I just, the thing that, I realize is, leaven doesn't take a whole lot to change people.
You're absolutely right.
I guess that's the point you're trying to get across here, too, that, and Chuck's right, just a little leaven makes a huge difference.
It can. We could, I think we could probably have anecdotes from, we could sit here and we could probably all share them from now until the next time we meet about both negative and positive things. I mean, we've all, I'd say we've all, but, most of us have probably heard the country song that Randy Travis sang about 3 wooden crosses. And I mean, that's a secular song. But the prostitute's son was the preacher that morning. And there was that little incident of people passing and that Bible being handed down, and he devoted his life to preaching the gospel. And if that had never happened, there's a pretty good chance that he probably wouldn't have turned out that way. Now, granted, that's a song and it's pretend, but, I mean, how many of us might have been a couple of conversations or a couple of events away from not obeying the gospel, not being here this morning? How many of us are here because of our spouse that led us to the gospel? or a brother-in-law or a father-in-law or whoever. It doesn't take a lot to make an entirely massive change in someone's life. And by that same token, when we're talking about sinful things, it can be the same. With the amount of history in my family, I have no doubt that if I was to go buy me a bottle of whiskey and sat down and drink it, I'd probably not be the same. I'd probably be real good at it. And that's certainly not the same leaven that we're talking about here that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were preaching, but I guarantee you I would be really, really good at that. And nobody would want to be around me anymore. So, it doesn't take a lot to make wholesale changes. Absolutely right, Marty. All right, let's read this section, verses 13 through 20. Now, when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is up in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. There's a lot here, so let's kind of try to go top to bottom. But there is a lot to be excited about. So what sticks out to us here?
First of all, verse 18, upon this rock I will build my church. That's used erroneously all over the place, but we know that he's saying that upon this confession, thou art the Son of God, I will build my church.
Okay, yeah. And we'll get there.
Yeah,
Oh.
I was going to leave that out, yeah.
Okay, so we will address that in a moment. But who's the Son of Man? What have we heard of that before? Is it in the Bible anywhere else, or is it just in the New Testament? We've heard it a lot, and I don't think we've read this passage before. But if you wouldn't mind, let's look at Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, beginning in verse 13, Daniel says this. He says, "I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed." I am never going to claim to be somebody that's great at going, yes, that's exactly where that prophecy is fulfilled. But in this particular instance, I can, with great confidence, say, yes, this is exactly where we see that prophecy of Daniel being fulfilled, because it's almost word for word. So, Son of Man, it always carried with it this. This should have been the things that people were thinking of. You know, it was just that phrase was prophetic unto itself. They should have been thinking, if he's calling himself the Son of Man, there must be something to it. Because this is, you know, I mean, who's the Ancient of Days? Who is, and then there's this kingdom that will not pass away. So even in the book of Daniel, it's letting the reader know, or it, I would hope would let the reader know, that this is not a physical kingdom, because if we know anything about physical kingdoms, they all pass away. That's one of the themes of Daniel, that the kingdoms of earth will pass away and they're all under God's control, because he rules in the kingdoms of men, whether we like it or not, or are aware of it or not. Yeah?
Back in, sorry, would you mind rereading, back in Daniel 7, would you mind rereading verse 13, please?
Sure. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming.
Okay, yeah, that Son of Man phrase is important to connect these two.
Yes.
You know, that has to do with his humanity coming in the form of an actual living person, human being.
Yeah. And that becomes important for multiple reasons as we progress into the later parts of the New Testament too, because there's the Gnostics and the Essene, all the folks that they wanted to say Jesus was not flesh and blood, but he was some kind of a apparition and things like that as well. So yes,
I think Matthew maybe uses that Son of Man phrase more than the rest of the other writers. So he's trying to drive that point home.
well, I mean, the establishing him as the king, the long-awaited king, you know, that was going to sit on the throne of David, that, you know, was going to establish this kingdom so that would rule throughout the ages. That, you know, you got to have somebody, and establishing him as that man, but also as God, has certainly been the goal here, and as that king. And then we have all these different people that Jesus gets compared to. You know, they say, some say you're John the Baptist. Others say that you're Elijah. Others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. There's a reason for that. Because John, what did John do that Jesus did? In Matthew 3, 1 through 8, we have John preaching, and he says, bear fruits worthy of repentance. That's the same message that Jesus echoes later on, but the way that he delivers it is with boldness, as one with authority. And he is preaching this new message that no one's ever heard. So that's probably a reason some might find some similarity there. With Elijah, Elijah exposed a lot of wickedness. The scribes, the Pharisees, those people that were supposed to be spiritually minded leaders, he just went right at them. And of course, that would be a similarity there. You know, 1 Kings is littered with the stories of Elijah. You know, Jeremiah was pretty complicated, and you know, he preached, and it was not with any man in mind. He was not a respecter of persons. He did not seek the favor of men, and he had no problems publicly condemning sinful behaviors. and sinful actions and teachings. And then Jesus, of course, had compassion. And that would be why we would, let's see, 2 Chronicles 36. I'm going to go ahead and read these two verses in 2 Chronicles 15 and 16 of chapter 36. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at him, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, until there was no remedy. You know, that same compassion is what we see magnified in Jesus time and time again. And so it's understandable that people would have seen these other individuals in Christ, but he was so much greater because he had everything that made all of them good and none of their imperfections. He was the fullness of truth. He was the fullness of God in flesh. He was the one that John predicted. He was the one that the prophets prophesied to come. He is the great Redeemer. He is the refiner's fire. And he came with compassion because, of course, he eventually died. All right, and so now on to verse 16. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And yes, it is a wildly misunderstood passage from here down. But let's see what it says. We saw earlier in our studies in Matthew 14 and 33 that the disciples, they did make a statement about him. You know, when he got into the boat and the wind ceased and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." They called him the Son of God, but here Peter acknowledges something that the multitudes have acknowledged. It's been hinted at, but he says, you are the Christ. You are the anointed one. You are the Messiah. You are the one that was sent. And everything's changed. And Jesus says, "For flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." How did God reveal that Jesus was the Christ to Peter?
Through Christ's words, number one. Number two, through his deeds. That would certainly reveal it. So, when they were sent out two by two, possibly through some revelation of the Holy Spirit. That'd be through that then.
It wasn't a trick question. Yeah, that's.
But you know, right now it looks like, Peter's pretty much got it together and he's on track.
Not for long.
Not for long. That's what I don't understand is how he would change, It seems like if you've seen all the miracles in person and, even if death come up, you would stick to the letter,
Well, but think about it this way. What had Jews been looking for forever?
Yeah, they're looking for a physical kingdom.
If you grew up in a house that said your shirt is orange, and you had been taught from the time you were a little boy until now that your shirt is orange, and I tell you, no, Chris, your shirt's blue, you're going to have times when you look at your shirt and you're going to go, this is an orange shirt. You might know that it's blue, but it's orange, because that's how you've been taught to think. That's a really simple example of that, but some of that is what's happening here.
You know, it's kind of like when John the Baptist's followers came and asked that, are you the one, or should we look for somebody else? Okay, Jesus could have came out and said, yes, I am the one. But what did he do? He kind of went around and said, well, tell him I healed the lame, the mute talking, he just told him, said, look at what I've done. If that don't prove who I am, then what can I say?
He was all about the evidence, yes.
So, to me, being one of the apostles that seen the dead raised, the people healed, regardless of what I was raised up to believe, seemed like that would change, you know what I mean? But, we're all human. I mean, everybody makes human mistakes. But I'm just saying this from a point of view, I would hope that if I was, not that I'm better than anybody else, but I'm just saying that I would hope that seeing these miracles in person, it would change my attitude as far as what I was raised to believe.
And it has for them, and it should for us too, yeah. And, but, I,
People just really don't want to change.
yeah.
The Pharisees come up and said, we've seen what you've done. We know, this is what man said, but you say that, but he said, the Pharisees, we know that you are of God, but yet they still wouldn't change because it was too much.
Yeah, he wasn't what they expected of their king. So they rejected him.
The Pharisees and Sadducees, to me, it seemed like they were still stuck on power and,
Yeah.
their heart just never was in the right place to, if you read the Old Testament, it seemed like they would see that this is not going to be a physical kingdom, but I don't know, like I said, it's one perspective, I don't know.
Well, and one of the things about this section of the Gospels that's so, the Pharisees and the Sadducees working together, like that. I mean, that's it. It is more far-fetched than turning on the news and the Democrats and Republicans are making sense when they're talking to each other. Like that's how opposed. I mean, the Pharisees, they were folks that believed that they were building themselves up because of their own acts of righteousness, because they were adhering to the law so perfectly, and they believed in the resurrection. And then you had the Sadducees who denied the resurrection, and they were the aristocratic class of Jews. These are not people that would have gotten along. And here they're coming to trap Jesus and try to trick him and all these things that we see and persecute him. And yeah, so I mean, it's a lot. And yes, to the point that I asked to begin with, yeah, Jesus was revealed through his power and his personage and all the things that he did. And Simon Peter finally puts it together in this statement. And then Jesus says, and you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So, sorry, that keeps rolling away. Build my, or well, what does he call Peter? This is kind of when we see on, you are Peter, and on this rock, his name's Petros, right? So, Is the church built on Peter? No. But that's what Jesus says. He says, on this rock. So it's Peter, right? Yes. On his confession that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And I will build my church. What's a church? What's church? UN, I like your definition the best. I've got a little definition here, but let's go ahead and read a little bit fuller of a Greek definition here. The word for church is ekklesia, and it means a calling out, or a meeting, or a congregation. So yeah, you're right too. An assembly, but here's as Thayer says, it's a gathering of the citizens called out of their homes into some public place or assembly. But when we're talking about Christ Church, we're not called out of homes. What are we called out of? The world. We are to be set apart from this world and the things of it. You know, he's calling us out to have a change in mind of what we shall do. And as we continue on through the end of this chapter, after he rebukes Peter, we're going to see some more of that. And in verse 24, I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. You know, when Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, so being called out, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. We're called to deny human reason, deny our worldly impulses, deny the things that entice us to this fleshly plane. And when we do that, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Christ has bought us with his blood, but we still have to follow him. All right, so this next, go for it.
In my regular Bible,
Okay.
Peter is Petrus,
Yeah.
and then it says rock, that's Petrus. One's a stone, one's a large rock of bedrock.
So
So it's not, he's a little version of the big rock.
thank you for finishing the thought that I squirreled off on. Thank you so much, Jim. But yes, you know, Peter is a small piece, whereas the rock is that confession, that truth that is the foundation, and that is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Thank you so much. So now, I'm going to be honest, I don't know if I ever understood this particular set of verses when I was a child, but I feel like I got it pretty good now, but y'all might correct me. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. What are the keys of the kingdom?
What brings us into the kingdom? What calls us? It's the gospel.
The way to gain access.
Yeah. So the gospel is the key, and that is, by everything I can figure out, that's got to be it. So, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So, were the apostles given permission to go out and judge and condemn people and say, you're bound in hell and you're loosed in heaven?
I think talk about the word of God. They're going to write, they're going to be the writers. They're going to be the ones that sit down and write in these things. And men are going to say, wait a minute, that Bible was just written by men.
Yeah, and we have imagery throughout the New Testament of sin being a chain or a bondage of some kind. If we are lost and dying in our sins, we are chained and bound. The same as the demons. Or,
Well, in verse, going back to 2, who were they constantly referring back to on not who to be like? In verse 6, the Pharisees and Sadducees. And what were they doing? A lot binding things that shouldn't have been bound.
so there's that similarity as well. Yes. And the blood of Christ and the gospel message frees us from that bondage of sin. So, and we will see this same type of language in just the next chapter as well. In 18, I believe. Yeah, in 18, and then 18, actually. So there is, you're absolutely right. Everybody gets a gold star. And then Jesus, he tells them, don't tell anybody I'm the Christ. Why is he doing that? Kind of back to Michael's comment, who are we talking about here? Who is this discussion about? Well, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Jesus knew their hearts. He knew their schemes. He knew what was fixing to happen. And he still has some things that he's preparing his disciples for. It's almost time, but it's not quite time. And that's where we're at.
Who would it have been natural for them to try to, say, prove or convince that Jesus was the Christ?
Yeah.
Those authority figures, right? People naturally gravitate to authority. And so if you can convince those who are in a position of authority, right, what winds up happening?
It's going to...
Trickle-down effect.
Yeah.
Of all of a sudden, these group of, let's call them proven, learned, men of authority are now saying, hey, right, this guy is Jesus Christ the Messiah. Just think about the impact that would have had. No wonder they were trying to convince them. But I mean, not to draw something that's not there, but
No, I'm with you.
well, I mean, Jesus is saying don't tell anybody because they naturally would have wanted to try to convince the Pharisees and Sadducees and probably knew it just wasn't going to happen.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if we could convince, the Gamaliels of the world and the Caiaphases of the world that, yes, this Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Christ. He's the one we've been looking for. Maybe they'll proclaim him before the people, and maybe everybody will believe and everything will change and it'll be sunshine and rainbows. But that wasn't what was going to happen, and maybe they were thinking that because, well, let's just keep reading. In verse 21, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. So maybe that was their impulse. Maybe they might have had that thought. But here's the thing. Jesus must go. Everything hinged on that. That's what he came here for. If Jesus didn't go before the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, if he wasn't led into a kangaroo court and scourged and crucified and died for the sins of the world, then he didn't accomplish his plan.
Think about it, he never came out and said, I am Jesus. You know, I think, like you said, they might have wanted to make him, they always did, they always want to make him a physical king. And his mission, the reason of being born as a baby and coming here was to die on that cross and shed his blood for us to be able to get better.
A physical kingdom was never the goal, and it wouldn't have done anything. So he taught his disciples that he must go. And, you know, we could talk about all the things that Jesus likely taught them about him being the propitiation that Paul writes about in Romans, that he's the mediator, that Paul writes about in 1 Timothy, you know. But here we have Peter, as we mentioned earlier, and this word here in verse 22 where it says, took him aside, the word implies pretty heavily that it was like he grabbed him and said, no, you're not going to do this. I thought about grabbing Dwayne, but I didn't want to scare him. No, and he's physically rebuking him. You know, and sometimes, you know, we all, or many people, and I tend to be one of them, we personify with Peter the most because he is very brash and he is very human. I mean, have we ever argued something that we knew was going to happen? You know, denial. His master, his teacher, the man that he just declared to be the Christ, the Son of God, that Peter has given up everything in his life to follow and he loves more than anyone else, said, I got to go to Jerusalem and all these people are going to kill me. I'd say Peter was a little bit in his feelings. And we have, you know, last year about this time, I was talking about cognitive distortions and emotional reasoning. Peter was making a very emotional decision here. He wasn't making the decision based on the teachings that Jesus had taught him or the things that he had observed. He was making the decision with his very human heart. And Jesus' response, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. That's what Jesus is pointing out to him. You're making decisions with your human heart. You're not thinking of the kingdom. You're not thinking of the things above. We can be just as guilty as Peter was here about a great number of things when we allow our wants and our feelings to make decisions instead of the Word of God. And let's go ahead and read the end of this, if I can talk Shane and Bruce into not hitting the button just yet. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you that there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. As I mentioned a bit ago, denying himself, denying human reason, choosing the will of God over himself. I think this last line is the one that is probably the most debated. But there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. All right, Dwayne, I know you got something you want to say. Go, Dwayne. Go.
You know, I'm surprised it's debated, but it sure is debated. It reads pretty straight to me. Be some pretty old people if the church is not the kingdom. Be some pretty old folks that are still waiting for the kingdom to come.
Yes, very much so.
Ridiculous.